Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Solidarity Wednesdays. I am Reverend Joseph Archie. I am the Wilmington District Superintendent, and also I serve as one of the Peace with Justice coordinators for the Peninsula-Delaware Annual Conference. And I am welcoming tonight two guests. We have the Reverend Rebecca Holland, who is with us. She is the Disability Ministries Task Force chairperson of the Susquehanna Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. And we have our own Reverend Dr. Rebecca Collison, who leads the Disabilities Committee of our own Peninsula-Delaware Annual Conference. Doug Lanter is with us also. He is our Director of Communications for the Peninsula-Delaware Annual Conference, and he will be monitoring our chat. So if you haven't been on our Solidarity Wednesdays program before, you should know that you can participate by putting comments in the chat and also questions in the chat. We will save or we'll look at comments and questions at the end. So we'll get right into it. And I want to start, I'll start with Reverend Holland. If you could please tell us a little bit something about your ministry and also your experience living with a disability, please.
Yeah, well, thanks again so much for including me and having me here today digitally. My name is Rebecca Holland, and I am an ordained elder serving in the Susquehanna Conference of the United Methodist Church. I currently serve two churches. I serve Christ Community and Lisbon United Methodist Church in Altoona, and I'm a graduate of Wesley Theological Seminary. I was born with bilateral congenital cataracts, which means I was born with cataracts on each eye, and that was back in the late 80s. And so really the only place in our general area that could even try to treat me was Wills Eye in Philadelphia. I had 9 surgeries before I was a year old to remove the cataracts and then the secondary membrane that grew back in place of them. And as a complication of surgery, I developed glaucoma. An air pocket formed in the back of my eye and placed pressure on the optic nerve, which caused significant vision loss. In my lifetime, I've lost count of the number of eye surgeries specifically that I've had. I think it's between 13 and 15, but it's been a lot. Lots of tube shunts and trabeculectomies and muscle surgery. The blessing and the joy of that is that I say that I have just enough vision to get me into trouble. So I can kind of walk a sort of half in between life. I can function in the sighted world with the proper adaptations, but I also have a heart and have a lot of experience with the blindness community. And so when I eventually got my call into ministry and when I started serving in the church and when I started going to seminary, I really felt a pull toward working for inclusion and advocacy for not just people who were visually impaired, but all people who might be part of any marginalized group. Because I really think that there's a lot of connections, we're all interconnected, and that we really are all better together. So it's been a joy serving in the Susquehanna Conference, but there's also a lot of challenges. Right now, we find that a lot of our struggles is just raising awareness. Because, for example, a lot of people, I truly believe, want to be inclusive, want to help other people, but they might just not know how, and they might not know the way to properly interact, perhaps, with a person who has no sight or a person who's unable to hear. So just simple things like talking about what hospitality looks like, talking about how it's not appropriate to touch another person's guide dog or wheelchair. Little things like that can make a big difference and can go a long way. In the Susquehanna Conference last year, we established our very own Disability Ministries Sunday, and we were really excited to celebrate that in October of last year, and we're hoping to celebrate again this year, probably in a different way since we can't gather in quite the same way, but part of that is also helping to spread information about ways that worship and ways that live streaming and ways that just worshiping in general can be accessible, especially now that we're in the digital, very, very digital age. If you're interested in more of my work or reading a little bit more about some of the things I'm working on, I do have a website where I blog about faith, books, and disability awareness. You can find it at beckywrites.com. And then also my most recent book is the United Method. Oh, look, it's backwards because it's on the computer. Is it backwards for you guys?
No, I can
No,
see
you're
it.
good.
Okay.
Great.
Well, it says the United Methodist Church and Disability, and it's got a red cover. It's available in both Kindle. It's available on Kindle and in large print. So it was important to me to make a book that I would actually be able to read myself. And if anybody wants a free copy, just because you think it would be a useful resource, I'm happy to send out a free digital copy or even a print copy. I have a lot of extra copies. So that's available to anyone who wants one.
Great, wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Let me turn to Dr. Collison then. Tell us about the work of the Disability Committee in the Peninsula-Delaware Conference, what you have been doing, what you're working on now. What do you have to share with us about that work?
Well, the Disability Ministry Committee that's in Peninsula-Delaware basically has four focus areas, and it's to engage people with disabilities within our communities, educate congregations about what disabling conditions are and what they're not. It's about equipping people who have disabilities and those who do not to be in ministry and connected together, and then to empower people with disability to be ministry leaders as we connect with one another in our community and in our church. Basically what we do is we encourage people to have a Disability Awareness Sunday. Technically for our conference, it is the last Sunday of January. And we kind of picked that because Christmas was over with, Super Bowl hadn't hit yet. And it was a Sunday we thought maybe folks would be looking for something to spur them on into the year. And we also have resources that are linked on our website. We used to do a Disability Connection Award, but beginning last year, we were able to take the accessibility audit and the new badging system, which I'll talk about later, and make that a way to help focus on churches who are really getting what it is to not only provide the physical spaces for people with disabilities in their churches, but also that have the attitudinal barriers that have come down as well in ministry with others. We also send folks to disability ministry conferences across the country, and we work with churches and districts as much as we can. On page 5 of our key leadership form that we all fill out, that our conference fills out during our charge conference season, which is coming up really fast. On page 5, there is a place there for Disability Ministries Committee. And every year I look to pull those names so that we can try to include them in the dialogue that the committee's having about what it is that they're doing in their local communities and how can we learn from one another and network with one another to include everyone within the body of Christ.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Collison. Reverend Holland, tell us, is there some more you might want to tell us about the specifics of what the Susquehanna Conference has been doing regarding ministries with disabilities?
So right now, what we are trying to do and our goal is to really connect with what the Greater Disability Ministries Committee is doing. We found people who are willing to volunteer to be resource persons in each of our districts. We'd like to get 2 or 3 in each district. Right now, I think we're almost at the point where we have at least 1 in each district. So that if there's a person within the district that has a question or a concern or is interested in being involved in disabilities or just looking for information, they have a person physically nearby that they can go to our website and they can look and see who's near me and what does this person know about. In the future, like I said, we'd like to get more of those point people, more of those resource people together. But we've also put together a website, which I maintain and try to update on a regular basis, where we try to get out news and information about disability awareness and things that are happening in the world and at large, not just in our conference, but just in the disability community in general. And that's really been a joy. Right now, I'm currently working on interviewing people throughout the disability community about what their experiences are with COVID-19 in the pandemic and what it might be like for them, as well as just what they want people to know. And so I'm publishing those interviews on about a weekly basis throughout the summer. We're calling it More Than Meets the Eye, interviews with the disability community. And so far, we've got a really interesting cross-section of people, not just from the United States, but we also had a young woman from Ghana. We've had people who are blind, people with invisible disabilities, and it's really great to give people the opportunity to share their own stories, because I think it's sharing our own stories and sharing our narratives that brings us closer together.
Now, are those interviews available on your blog?
Yes, you can find them on my blog at beckywrites.com. And then after the whole series is done, I'll put a list of all the interviews on the Disabilities for the Susquehanna Conference website. So you can just go through and click on all of them.
Great, thank you. And at some point, I'd like, hopefully Doug can put in the chat box some of the resources and connection to the website and your blog, so that people will have that information there as well. So thank you for sharing that. Dr. Collison, you talked a little bit earlier about the accessibility audits that are part of our charge conference paperwork. I get the feeling as a district superintendent that for many, it's something that they do, the trustees and the pastor, we tend to do it at the last minute when we know charge conference is coming up, and we've got to fill out the forms. And so in many cases, we probably hastily, answer the questions without putting too much thought in it throughout the year. Share with us how we can actually use the accessibility audits as part of a strategic plan for how we engage ministry.
Okay, well, recently in the last couple of years, we have revisited the form of the accessibility audit, because we realize people are in different places with their buildings, but disability ministry is not just about building ramps or access into a building. It's more involved than that. So if you ever look at the audit now, there's a couple things you'll notice that are different. There are things that you can use to help guide your church on what next steps you can take in disability ministries. They begin with questions about getting into the church, and then questions about getting around the church. It looks at questions about how your sanctuary and your classrooms are set up, the seating, the access not only to those rooms, but to what's going on in those rooms, those worship centers. And then there comes a part about communication. Do you have large print? Do you have projected words? Are there is there captioning not only on your worship, anything that's on a screen, but also if you have a Bible study and you're running a video, do you run the captioning to help people who may not exactly hear everything that's said, but the captioning will help include them within that process. Also, microphones, the use of microphones, assisted listening systems. Do you have copies of your sermon? Do pastors have copies of their sermon, or at least an outline, so that someone could follow along? And these are things that, with communication in the environment, that are key in keeping everyone connected with what's going on in the space. And then the last, actually about 10 items, actually 11 items on the accessibility audit, focus on attitudes. Because one of the biggest areas that we struggle with including people with all different ability levels or different abilities is attitudinal barriers can sometimes get in the way. We assume somebody has understood us, or we assume somebody can see that someone else can. And some of these measures are about signage. Do we have a sign? Because if you've been in a church very long, well, everybody knows where the restroom is, but not everybody knows where the restroom is, especially if you're a guest. So signage is important. Are disruptions welcome in the congregational setting? I've had a couple of churches where I would have a person with some cognitive challenges, and in the middle of the sermon, they may say something that's totally, it might seem totally inappropriate, but they're part of our church family. And we just kind of keep on going with that. Sometimes we acknowledge it, and sometimes we don't, but they're a part of our church family. And do they feel that? Do we show that hospitality to everyone? Do we use inclusive person-first language, seeing the person before we attach a label to them? In other words, you wouldn't say a deaf man, you would say a man who is deaf. You would always use person first language. To be able to rise in body and in spirit is something we try to do at a lot of our gatherings, because there's some folks who physically cannot stand, when they ask people to stand up for a song or something, and they can't stand, and it makes them feel left out when they can't do that. So we say rise in body or spirit to include whether you physically can or not, your spirit is still rising up with everyone else's. Holding a Disability Awareness Sunday. You would be amazed how many people who do not do that. And it's actually very easy to do that. We have such a rich hymnody within our church that all you have to do is pick one of those hymn writers and you can do a service even about them, or get someone to share their experience. For example, Fanny Crosby, who wrote To God Be the Glory. She was blind. Charlotte Elliott, who wrote the song Just As I Am, was bedridden. Major Daniel Whittle, who wrote Have You Any Room for Jesus, was an amputee from the war. And Joseph Schreiben, who wrote What a Friend We Have in Jesus, suffered from mental illness. And yet they have given us such gems of their understanding of who God is that we can learn from. Those of us who are considered able-bodied can learn from that. And so that's another thing, is to hold a Disability Awareness Sunday and see how that connection with the body of Christ is made. Using the gifts of people with disabilities in our decision making also fall on this accessibility audit. As we were, one church I was at, we were strategically planning how to put another ramp access into the building, because the ramp we had was at the furthest away point that was furthest away from the sanctuary. And there were two options, and one was down an alley, and one would require a little bit of construction to get folks into the building easily. And those who were sitting around the table making these decisions were all able to walk into the room under their own power. And I said, wait a minute, maybe we need to ask the folks who are going to be using this. Yes. And include their voices. So we talked to the folks who used walkers and such, and they didn't want to come in by an alley. They didn't want to come in by a back door. That was their church. They wanted to go in like everyone else did. And that's what we did. We created the entryway wide enough, the access, a push button for that door, so they would feel welcome in their own church and not as a burden. Because we want to give people the ability to be as independent as they can possibly be or want to be. And that is a lot of what this accessibility audit does. So in the strategic planning within the local church, what you do is you take this, you say, well, where could we change it from a no to a yes in the next year? And something that simple helps move your church forward in meeting the needs of people with disabilities in your congregation. And it's not a fact of, well, we don't have people here in wheelchairs. Maybe there's a reason we don't have people here in wheelchairs.
Yes.
And we have to think about, why don't we have those folks here? Well, sometimes you got to put something in place for someone to feel welcome to come into it. So that's how the accessibility audit can help a church move forward from a no to a yes. And we've actually, the national committee who put this together has now put together the badging system. So if you hit a certain number of these in the yes category, there's levels of bronze, and then higher level is silver, and then the higher level is gold. And that means there are some large churches that have the accessibility to the building, but they're not meeting it with the attitudinal parts. And there are some of our small churches who just really do such a good job at this in being hospitable to all people who come to their doors. And they were recognized as well. So it wasn't just a big church thing. It's for all size churches. All size churches have a way that they can be involved in ministry to people with disabilities.
Thank you. I guess this question would be for both of you in turn. I'll ask Reverend Holland first and then Dr. Collison second. speak, if you would, about the leadership at the annual conference level, and how have they been helpful, leaders in the annual conference, or unhelpful in helping to promote better ministry with persons with disabilities?
So in the Susquehanna conference, one of the things that has been really beautiful, I think, in the past is that during our annual conference sessions, now not this year because everything was online, but in the past, we had a person who was a sign language interpreter at all of the big events at annual conference. And it was, for me especially, it was really something beautiful, even though I personally don't know much sign language. I can fingerspell. I've had friends who are deafblind. But to just see her there front and center, signing so beautifully, signing homilies and signing hymns. And it was just really wonderful and amazing because for me, it was a symbol, a very, very clear symbol that our conference was trying. And I think symbols are important because that was something that, you know, it's expensive, but when you consider putting together a whole conference, it's definitely not the most expensive thing, but it's a very clear symbol that people are making an effort. In the future, the Disability Ministries Task Force of the Susquehanna Conference, we're working together to try to make sure that when we can gather again safely, that continues to be an option, because we ran into some technical difficulties with that last year. But a member of our committee, Reverend Jeanette Wirtz, who actually has I believe, a family relation who is a member of the deaf community, was able to step in and volunteer to offer her signing gifts. So it was really great to have those resource people and that connection that we could pull from, people who are willing to put a lot of time and effort into that. And one of the questions that people asked, they said, is anyone actually using the signer? Is anyone actually using sign language interpretation? And I said, you know, that's an excellent question because we didn't know. We didn't have a way to collect that information. Maybe at ordination and commissioning service, or maybe at the retirement service somebody was, but we really didn't know. And so maybe in the future, one of the things our committee suggested was including during registration, when you fill out your registration, maybe just put a little box that says, what accommodations would you find useful? So it's a learning and growing effort. One of the things we also did that was small but significant was last year at an annual conference, one of our members said, hey, do you realize that we don't have priority seating near the front during annual conference? It's just find whatever seat you can find and camp out. And so that was something that was easy to add, but made a big difference for a lot of people.
Thank you. That's important. Dr. Collison.
We've been very blessed in that our bishop is a proponent of disability ministries and has kind of been on the leading edge of that with our conference. We, of course, we have American Sign Language interpreters at our annual conference gathering, but we also have them available at the youth rally because we have had some young people who needed interpreters. So we made sure that was available. We have been increasingly captioning things that are going up on a screen so that folks may not hear completely in the room, but that they can see it on the screen. We have been working on the same thing, making sure that those who need seating in certain areas or space to navigate scooters or wheelchairs or such, that space is being made available. And we've had in other locations, we've had our conference, of course, held in Wilmington, which was all on one floor, which was great. And we've also had it held in Princess Anne at UMES. And at UMES, since there were different buildings involved, there were shuttles for those who could not make the walk all the way across due to different challenges they might have. So there have been a lot of things in that regard that have been done. We still have more things to do on our conference. For example, our conference offices, we only have one right now, I believe, that's on the first floor that someone could just go straight into. And I know two of them, I believe, do not have any elevator access to get anyone to a second floor that might have mobility issues. So we still have some areas to work in and work on. But, those are things that we constantly put before us. What is it we can do better the next time? What worked really well this time? What were we missing on, and how can we improve upon it?
Great. we've been talking about how the church in particular in the Susquehanna Conference and in the Peninsula-Delaware Conference have done ministry with folks who are dealing with disabilities. Both of you in turn, share what you think the church could be doing more to promote justice for those outside of the church, those in the greater society. How can the church be an advocate for justice in a better way than we have been to promote equity in that way? Either of you could take it. Either of you could take it.
I'll go ahead. I think a lot of it comes down to knowing where to start. And there was a study that I wrote so that local churches could have a resource that they could just pick up and use and not have to purchase. And it is on the Pendel website's disability ministry page. And it's on my blog page, which is RebeccaCollison.com. It's on there as well. And it basically says, to be an advocate, you need to start with ACT, to act. And A is you've got to acknowledge what's going on. You've got to ask the questions. You've got to learn everything you can about what's going on in your community, in your state, in your region. For example, when I was in Delaware, I found out that those some folks who are working in the sheltered workshops, maybe they have cognitive challenges, they were getting paid less than minimum wage, and that was considered acceptable. And the reasoning was because of their disability and the extra help they needed and things like that. But that's an equity issue too, because what happens a lot of times is that people with disabilities tend to be either unemployed or underemployed. And because of getting put into a cycle of poverty, a lot of times they don't have access to appropriate health care or housing, educational opportunities, and they're missing all of that because of some of the other things that they've gotten caught in a cycle. So we don't assume what a person might need or what we assume what's in our neighborhood. We need to ask and acknowledge what's there. The C comes in that we need to communicate that there is an injustice present, and we need to say that in a clear and concise way. Back in 2014, there was a book written, and there was a cry that went out that nothing for us without us. In other words, you don't get a group of able-bodied people over here that make all the decisions for those people.
Yes.
You need to bring folks with that disability to the table and let them be in conversation, be in relationship. That's the thing. Legislation can provide a ramp, but it is the relationship that moves us forward into really making a change in our communities and in the lives of people. So we need to do that. We need to see what injustice is being done. Is it about inequity in salaries? Is it or employment, or access to education, or access to healthcare? Where's the injustice coming in? And there's lots of different levels, depending on which group of folks you're talking about. And then you take it to the people. You take it to the courthouse, to the classrooms, and into our churches. That's the T part of it. That advocacy can range from coming together on a protest to talking to government officials. Like right now, there is a movement that is coming up. There's a lawsuit coming up to our White House because there has not been a sign language interpreter for these press briefings. And there should have been someone there. And that should have been a given. And this information that is important to the public is important to all the public. So all the public needs to have that access. So we take it to our government officials and make that a point of letting them know about that. We can provide support for group homes that are in our neighborhood and kind of foster and adopt them and walk with them in what challenges they have. We can offer respite care for parents of children with severe and multiple disabilities, as well as respite care for families who have a child who has grown now in their 40s and 50s and are having challenges. And, it's where do we navigate to next? And we need to walk together with that. But we need to identify, it's not just about legislation. It's also about, that's a piece of it, but it's about heart. You got to be in a relationship. You got to talk to people. One of the things I did in the study was say, go find somebody who has a disability who you don't know already and ask them. Yes. Ask them about their life, ask them about themselves, and get to know the person before you start, trying to fix their situation. It's all about relationship.
Yes.
So that's where I would go in from. And I'm sure Reverend Rebecca's got a lot of ideas.
Yes. So let me just make a comment, and we'll get Reverend Holland in on that particular question as well. But what you shared, we can apply that same measure across the board. Certainly on Solidarity Wednesdays, we've been talking about immigration issues and issues of racial justice and so many other things. And we find the same thing applies. Build relationships with those who are differently able. Build relationships with those who are victims of injustice across the board. And so I just wanted to share that humanness of us all. That's who we are. We're made in the image and likeness of God. Each of us precious in the sight of God, and all of us have the same needs: the need for relationship, the need for closeness, the need for an opportunity to be heard and valued and appreciated. So I just wanted to get that in there. So, Reverend Holland, you have some thoughts about how we might be able to, in solidarity, promote justice for those living with disabilities?
I think everything that Reverend Dr. Collison said was excellent. And I really want to just emphasize that I think that it's small heart changes that can make a really big difference. I think in our world, there's this attitude that, we think if a person has a disability, that person is very sad and is in need of charity. And that might be the case, but I think it's also important for people to understand that the disability community is complex and diverse, and that there are people who are blind or who are deaf or who have any number of disabilities and who are happy, and even people for whom their disability is an important part of their identity. One of my closest friends is completely blind, and her fiance is also visually impaired, and she was raised in the church, and so was he. And they tell a story about how they went church shopping. Right? They started visiting different congregations, and she has a guide dog, and he uses a white cane. And just the awkwardness that would happen when they would walk into different churches, because many people, while good intentioned, often didn't know how to interact or how to treat a person who was blind. And they said that so often people would assume that they were there in order to request some type of charity, which wasn't the case. They were actually both young professionals looking for a worshiping community, but that's just the assumption. Yeah. Or people would approach them and assume that they wanted prayer. And he has this really great quote that I highlighted in my book where he says, you can pray for me. Please pray for me. I love prayer, but don't pray for me because I'm blind. I'm blind and I'm happy. Pray for me because, and he has a list of any other number of litany of things that are wrong that we all need prayer for. And I think that's such an important realization, because in the media, if you see a person who is blind or a person who is in a wheelchair, often they're portrayed as this poor, tragic figure, or as the fact that their disability is the only thing that defines them. And it's so much more complex than that. And so I think things like this, like Solidarity Wednesday, are really, really great, because they can show people with disabilities or people from any number of marginalized communities in positions of leadership or in positions where they're happy and leading fulfilled lives. And not only the people who receive charity, but the people who can also be partners in ministry and partners in providing charity to others, because we're all in need sometimes.
Yes, and we all have been given gifts from God to be able to be used to build up the kingdom of God and to help the ministry of the church, and that's important. Dr. Collison, would you care to say anything? You're a parent of some sons. We had conversation who are have dealt with various disabilities. Did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I had two children. Two of my four boys were born with different disabilities. One, he was a 10-week early preemie, and he has mild cerebral palsy. And actually, when he was in high school, he there was an incident. He hit his head, and there was a blockage in his brain, so they had to put a shunt in. And because of the intracranial pressure at the time, he has a little bit of difficulty with short-term memory, but once it gets in, he's good. So there were some learning strategies that we used, and he used them in college, and he now works down at Wallops Island as an engineer. And another son was born, and we found out about the time he was 2.5 years old that he had a hearing disability. And the problem was where exactly was the best fit for him to go to school, because he was like too deaf for the public school, but he was too hearing for the deaf school. So he ended up spending half the time one school and half the time in the other. He was probably the talkingest deaf kid they'd ever seen.
Yes.
And but he's been able to, he now is totally deaf on one side and has a loss on the other side. And he's been navigating through college and through employment and things like that, having to educate and advocate, educate his employers and his teachers about his disability, as well as advocate for himself to get certain resources and for people to understand. Because one of the things we talk about is you think, well, we give everybody equal access, and we talk about equity. And I shared an image with you that shows you can give people the an equal amount of something, and that's called equality, but still you've got folks who still can't see over the fence. But equity is really giving whoever needs the extra, giving it to them so that they can reach the same point of accessibility as other people. So instead of just everybody getting a box to stand on, then you give the box or two boxes to the folks who need it the most, so that everybody gets the same opportunity. And that being the big difference when it comes to even disability, working with folks with disabilities and providing opportunities. That I mean, I'm 5'2" and I can't reach the top stuff on the shelf in the grocery store, but my 6'2" husband can. Yeah. I would need that box. He doesn't. But for us each to be able to reach that same point, I would need, I'm vertically challenged, I guess you could say. I would need a little bit extra height in order to do, I mean, it's a very simplistic definition or
I can relate. I can relate to the height.
Illustration, but it really, you start thinking about it in other ways, it validates. So you have a sign language interpreter at an event and maybe only two people, but it's providing them the access, and that's what they need. It's like the one that Jesus goes after, that's just as important as the 99 who are sitting there and can get it where they are.
You sound like a preacher now.
Sorry. But that's, that's my heart for it. It started there. Then I was a special education teacher for several years, and I taught my high schoolers how to advocate for themselves, because when they went into the world, they were going to have to know what worked for them and what didn't work for them, so they could be as independent as possible. And then God just took me on into ministry from there.
Amen. Well, never be sorry for preaching. That's who God has called you to be. One of your sons who you've spoken of, Patrick, of course, he feels God's call on his life to be in pastoral ministry. And so that's important to lift up as well. So thank you for that. Thank you. You have a book also, Dr. Collison. It's not about ministry with disabilities, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to share that also. Many of our folks within our annual conference might not know that you have written such a book, and it is valuable nonetheless. So can you talk about that for a minute, please? Yeah,
I don't have it here to show you. I didn't bring it in the room with me, but it's Preparing Fields for Seasons of Change. And basically it's focused at churches in small and rural setting churches, because too often we think, oh, well, they're a small church, so they're just going to die out. They're old fashioned. but there's a lot within the Bible that's got agrarian roots to it. I mean, Jesus's parables that were agrarian based dealt with agriculture, dealt with the land, and how we can use the land references within the Bible to inform our small and rural churches on how they can grow and thrive in any season, whether it be a fallow season, a planting season, a growing season, or a harvest season, and how God works in and through every one of the seasons that we face as a church, and basically how that works, but also how someone can use the stories within the church to raise up where that church is and the next faithful steps that God has for that church. Too often I saw where small churches were trying to fit themselves into big church models.
Yes.
And they have good ideas, but the small church is unique in of itself. And it is at the place that is where community is really strong most of the time, in those farming communities, in those rural communities, where if something goes bad, everybody shows up to help out, or everybody shows up to feed you. And that's important in growing a church community, in growing the body of Christ. Even if it's a dozen or 20 people gathered, God is still in the midst. And that's what that book kind of focuses on. It walks you through agrarian theology, the biblical underpinnings of that, and how 4 churches in Sussex County, which is in the Dover district, went through the study together and kind of learned some about their churches and shared their stories. And there's a study at the back of it that any church could use to raise up the stories within that church and see where God has played the season they are in, so they'll know the next faithful step to take.
I'm really excited to read it. The 2 churches that I serve are small rural churches, and I love them so much. And we just did the parable of the sower, and people were so excited for that parable. They were so happy. So yes. It sounds like that would really preach and work well in my context.
It comes out August 28th, and there's some book signings on our conference that are taking place, and it's available with Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
Do you have it in Kindle format?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Wonderful. Well, let me invite all of you who are listening, if you have some questions or comments for Reverend Holland or for Reverend Dr. Collison, you can start putting them in the chat now. Let me just mention something that came to my mind. Going back to the ministry of the churches, I know last summer, Bishop Peggy Johnson and several of us ministers in the annual conference with clergy and lay together went to the Redbird Missionary Conference, and many of us have gone to Redbird for mission trips. But the thing about that particular mission trip, I remember that Bishop Johnson and Carol Stevens and others were purposely wanting to make sure that that was a trip that could be very inclusive for those who had or living with disabilities. And so I want each of our local churches, when you do your mission trips, to make that a consideration so that you can accommodate those who have various abilities to be able to come and be a part of those mission trips and contribute to them as well. So just a thought I wanted to add as well. Reverend Holland, are there any final thoughts that you would like to add before we take some questions or comments, if there are any?
I guess just one of the things I always like to point out is that the people with disabilities are already in our churches. Our churches are already full of people who are getting older, who are getting grayer, and we are one of the largest communities in the United States. If you look at the statistics, I think when I checked recently, it said that as many as 26% or 25% of people within the American population self-identify as having some type of disability. And a lot of that is related to aging. But it's important, I think, to realize that people with disabilities are such a big minority group and they're already here. So how can we continue to help and equip people as they get older and as they perhaps develop hearing issues or sight issues, so that they know that despite the fact that they might have developed a new disability, they can still serve God in new and exciting ways.
Thank you. Well, Brother Doug, do we have some questions or comments in the chat that we can lift up now?
The only one that I see is, what are the rules and regulations from the government's perspective to ensure houses of worship be equipped with accessibility towards people who have disabilities?
I can talk about this from firsthand experience, but Reverend Dr. Collison might have a more academic response.
Sure, go ahead.
So right now, with the separation of church and state, it is my personal understanding that churches are not required to do anything to promote disability access. However, just because we're not required to do anything doesn't mean that we should not do anything. During my time in seminary, for example, I was approved to get a guide dog, and I was very excited to go into work and train with a guide dog and then to come back and putter all around DC. And I was told at that time at that United Methodist seminary that I was not permitted to have a guide dog. At first they said, no guide dog on campus. It's distracting and people are allergic. And then when I pressed the issue, they said, okay, you can have a guide dog, but you cannot have it in the dorms. And so I talked to the National Federation of the Blind, which I'm a member of, and they encouraged me to continue to pursue the issue. And when I did, I told them that according to the law on the Americans with Disabilities Act, that I could have a guide dog anywhere I was allowed to go. And they told me that we were a church, and since we were a church-funded school and a church institution, we didn't have to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And they were right. They didn't. So in the end, I didn't get the guide dog. And that was a sad situation, but I learned firsthand that I know I'm not the only person who's encountered a situation like that. So that partially helped inspire me in my church to think, what can we do and how can we be more inclusive?
Well, that's disappointing. That's Wesley Seminary you're referring to?
Yes, but I believe that's probably changed. That was quite a while ago. I'm getting old and gray, and there's new leadership, and there's all types of changes. But at the time, that was the response.
Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm a Wesley graduate, and Dr. Collison too. So I want to lift them up. I love Wesley Seminary, but
yes, and everything else about them was
disappointed
wonderful.
about that they didn't accommodate you on that in that experience.
Well, the only exception to that would be if you are building a new church building or putting an addition on, then you are bound by the guidelines of a new structure. The ramp would have to be, 1 inch to 1 foot rise. You would have to have, 3 foot handicap bathroom in the facility. If you have a new construction, then yes, you do have to follow those guidelines for the structure. But that's really the only guideline that would be applicable to houses of worship.
Yes, I understand that. I think there was another question that came.
Yes. How can we be more open to people with emotional disabilities and autism?
So we had a really positive experience with that at Christ Community United Methodist Church in Altoona, where I serve. In just talking to different people, and we also did a spiritual gifts survey, I found that we had a number of teachers within our congregation, as well as a number of people who had experience working with people with autism or students with disabilities. And so when we asked also in the community and asked around and said, what would be a need that we could meet? One of the requests we actually received was, do you have any type of autism support group? And so for a time before COVID-19, we had put together a small group that met. And one of the people who attended the group was a teacher's aide. Another person was a teacher. A couple of the people had children or grandchildren with autism. And it was just a really positive place where we could talk and we could have snacks, and the teacher's aide and the teacher could talk about different things that had worked for them. And the parents and the grandparents could find support. The issue that we had is that with everyone having such diverse needs and diverse scheduling, it was hard to get together and hard to find a time that worked for everyone. But when people were able to gather and to attend that was really positive. And so I think that it wouldn't be too hard or too expensive or too difficult to put together a small group like that in any setting.
And I know in one church that they have a kind of a safe space where if someone feels anxious, if someone feels like they're being crowded, if someone feels like they're on the verge of kind of losing it, if you will, that they can go into this safe space, whether it be a prayer room, whether it be a room off to the side, that just to kind of decompress a little bit, because sometimes just being in a room with a lot of people can bring up, emotional issues and can cause triggers in some people that have autism. A lot of it is about grace and just acceptance as well, just being as hospitable, being supportive, because if you have an autistic child and the parent is feeling very anxious and afraid to bring their child into worship, it's just being a support for that parent. It's okay. We're here for you. Again, it's the relationship piece. It's like Reverend Holland said, it's building the relationship with folks and finding out what is it that you need in this moment that would be helpful to you.
Okay, it follows up with this. What about adults with autism? This seems to be a need, yet we have not found resources. The crowded church is not where they want to be. Do you have any suggestions?
I just, I know of an autistic adult, and they are at a small church, and that works wonderfully for them. The community and just the group of folks that are there, it works. It's a perfect fit for them. It's a matter of finding that space and that church community that suits their needs. And for them, for that particular person, that particular small church, excuse me, worked well for them.
Right. Is that the end of our comments and questions, Brother Doug?
That's what it looks like for now, yeah.
All right, wonderful. This is the very last Solidarity Wednesdays broadcast that we will have for a while. We might very well come back sometime in the fall and have some additional broadcasts of Solidarity Wednesday. The idea, again, was to highlight various communities that have suffered from injustice, and as a church, follow the maxim of the prophets who tell us that justice should roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, and that the Lord requires of us to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. And so I want to say thank you to Reverend Holland for being with us tonight. Again, she is a pastor in the Susquehanna Conference and leads the disability committee work in that annual conference. And I want to say thank you to Reverend Dr. Rebecca Collison, who is a pastor in our Peninsula-Delaware annual conference and leads the disability committee work in this annual conference. Thank you for being with us, Brother Doug Lanter, who is our communications director at our annual conference level. And he's been with us throughout this, our time of Solidarity Wednesday broadcast, along with Reverend Dr. Rob Townsend, who is our Director of Connectional Ministries. And so, again, thank you all for joining us on tonight. This is a recorded broadcast, and it is available along with the other Solidarity Wednesdays from weeks past. They're all available on the conference website, pen-del.org. And any final thoughts, Brother Doug?
No, we shared the different resources in the chat tonight. I'll include that on the website as well with this video once it's edited and up. So if anybody wants to find those resources again for the books and different websites, that'll be posted there as well. And this will also be on YouTube in a day or two. So if anybody is looking to find it, you can find it there.
When it's on YouTube, could you send me a link?
Sure, absolutely. I'll send everybody a link in this group so they can use it and send it to people as needed.
Will there be closed captions on the YouTube video?
I will do my best to make that happen.
Okay, just wondering. Thank you.
Yep. It's the first time that's been asked, so.
Amen.
If you need help, let me know. I just recently learned how to close caption YouTube videos.
Yeah, I think I know what I'm doing, but if I need some assistance, I'll reach out, but we'll get it done.
Thank you.
And we'll do it moving forward from here on out.
Amen.
Okay, well, thank you all again for joining us. Thank you again, Reverend Holland. Thank you, Dr. Collison. And remember, we're all in this thing together. We're in solidarity, each and every one of us as children of the Most High God. God bless you all. Have a good night.
Thank you, Reverend Archie.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.